Wichita, Kansas, the heartland of America. In the early 1970s, it was a city that embodied a certain kind of promise, a promise of safety, community, and quiet prosperity. It was a place where families grew, where neighbors trusted each other, and where the horror seen on the national news felt a world away. It was precisely this idyllic backdrop that made the crimes that followed so profoundly shocking. This is the story of a monster who thrived in the mundane, a predator who hid not in the shadows, but in the bright, unforgiving light of normalcy, a monster who called himself BTK. To understand the monster, you must first understand the man. His name was Dennis Rader. Born in 1945, Rader's life was a portrait of ordinary American masculinity. He served honorably in the U.S. Air Force. Upon returning, he married his sweetheart, Paula, and they started a family, eventually having 2 children, a son and a daughter. He held a series of respectable jobs, from working in an outdoor supply company to installing security alarms for ADT, a chilling irony, as he was the very person people were trying to protect themselves from. By the 1990s, he had become a Park City compliance officer, a man who patrolled neighborhoods, ensuring residents kept their lawns tidy and their pets leashed. He was a familiar, if sometimes annoyingly strict, face of local authority. His life centered around family and faith. He was a troop leader for the Cub Scouts. Most notably, he ascended to become the president of his congregation at the Christ Lutheran Church. He was, by all public measures, a pillar of his community, a good man. But behind the closed doors of his mind, a very different reality festered. Rader was host to a malevolent force he privately termed Factor X. It was a dark compulsion, a complex web of violent and sadistic fantasies that had consumed him since boyhood. He would later confess to torturing and killing stray animals, early rehearsals for the human tragedies to come. He lived a true double life. The public Dennis Rader was a character, a mask of sanity meticulously crafted to conceal the predator that lurked within. And in the cold winter of 1974, that predator decided it was time to hunt. Act 2, The Reign of Terror. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, Dennis Rader put his plan into action. He drove to the home of the Otero family, armed with what he called his hit kit. He cut the phone line, a signature move, ensuring his victims were utterly isolated, posing as a detective investigating a problem in the area. He talked his way inside. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their 2 young children, Josephine, age 11, and Joseph Jr., age 9, had no reason to suspect the friendly-seeming man. Once inside, Rader's demeanor changed. The mask fell away. What followed was a pre-planned symphony of terror. He calmly explained that he was wanted in another state and just needed money and a car. He assured them they wouldn't be harmed if they cooperated. It was a lie designed to keep them compliant. He bound them with meticulous care, using intricate knots he had practiced for years. This process, the binding, was a core part of his ritual. The terror, the power, the complete control. This is what Factor X craved. After securing the family, he murdered them one by one. He then took a few keepsakes, a radio and a watch, souvenirs of his conquest, and vanished back into his ordinary life. The discovery of the crime scene sent a shockwave of horror through Wichita. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and monstrously cruel. The city's innocence was shattered overnight. A phantom killer was among them. A few months passed. Then, in October, Rader made his next move. He craved credit for his masterpiece. He typed a letter, placed it inside an engineering book at the Wichita Public Library, and anonymously called a local newspaper reporter, telling him where to find it. The letter was a bombshell. In it, he gave a chillingly detailed account of the Otero murders, information only the killer could know. He warned of more victims to come. And at the bottom of the page, he gave himself a name, a brand for his unique flavor of evil. He wrote, P.S. The code words for me will be, bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. The boogeyman finally had a name. Throughout the late 1970s, BTK's terror continued. He stalked, he killed, and he communicated. He developed a disturbing relationship with the media and the police, seeing them as his audience. He would sometimes call the police dispatch himself, his voice calm and steady, to report the location of his latest victim. He sent bizarre, taunting packages, a letter to a TV station, a poem about one of his victims, complex puzzles. This cat-and-mouse game fueled his ego. He was not just a killer. In his mind, he was an artist, a criminal mastermind outsmarting everyone. Then, after his seventh known murder in 1977, the killings appeared to stop. The letters ceased. The taunts went silent. For years, the city of Wichita held its breath. The BTK case grew cold. Detectives retired. Leads dried up. Many began to believe the killer had died, moved away, or was finally incarcerated for some other crime. The city slowly, cautiously began to heal. Act 3, the intermission. But Dennis Rader was not gone. He was hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, his own life. He was busy. He was raising his kids, attending church, arguing with neighbors about overgrown lawns. He was living the American dream. The question that baffled psychologists for years was, how did he stop? How does a predator with such powerful compulsions simply go dormant? Rader would later explain that his urges were satisfied through a dark world of fantasy and souvenirs. He would revisit his crimes in his mind, reliving every moment of terror and control. He kept meticulous notes and collected items from his victims, driver's licenses, clothing, photographs. These tokens allowed him to feed Factor X without physically killing again. He was, in his own twisted way, a collector. His collection was not of stamps or coins, but of human lives. This long silence, this intermission, is perhaps the most unsettling part of the BTK's story. It demonstrated a level of patience and self-control that is terrifying. He wasn't a frenzied, out-of-control madman. He was a disciplined predator who could choose when to hunt. But by the early 2000s, something had changed. The world was moving on. A new generation was growing up who had never heard of BTK. For a man with an ego as vast as Dennis Rader's, being forgotten was a fate worse than death. His legacy was fading. On the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, in 2004, Factor X demanded a curtain call. BTK decided it was time to return. He resurfaced with a dramatic flair, sending a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper containing the driver's license of a victim from 1986, a case that had never been officially linked to him. The message was clear: I never left. The fear, once a dull scar on the city's memory, was suddenly a fresh, bleeding wound. But BTK returned to a world he no longer understood. It was an age of DNA analysis, of digital forensics, of the internet. Trapped in his 1970s mindset, he believed he was still the smartest person in the game. It was this hubris that would finally bring him down. He began a bizarre and steady correspondence with local media and the police, sending packages containing dolls bound in the same way as his victims and more letters. In one of these communications, he made a fatal inquiry. He asked the police, through a coded message, if they could trace his location from a floppy disk. The police, sensing a monumental opportunity, played his game. They responded via a newspaper ad with a single word: Rex. It was a signal he had proposed, meaning, yes, it will be safe. The lie worked. On February 16, 2005, BTK mailed a padded envelope to a local TV station. Inside was a floppy disk. The moment it landed in the hands of the task force, the 31-year manhunt entered its final hours. Digital forensic experts swarmed the disk. They found a deleted Microsoft Word document, and within its metadata, a digital ghost. The document was last modified by a user named Dennis at a location identified as the Christ Lutheran Church. The name and place were cross-referenced with the church's staff. The council president was a man named Dennis Rader. The puzzle was solved. Investigators secured a warrant for a pap smear his daughter had taken at a university clinic years earlier. The DNA from her sample was compared to the DNA from the BTK crime scenes. It was a familial match. They had found their man. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was driving home for his lunch break, perhaps contemplating what lawn needed mowing, when the street filled with police cars. The man who had terrorized the city for 3 decades was arrested without incident. In the interrogation room, the mask crumbled. He confessed to everything. narrating 10 murders with chilling, detached calm, as if describing a day at the office. The revelation sent a seismic shock through the world. His family was destroyed. His daughter, Carrie, would later write that in one moment, her entire life, every memory of her loving father, became a lie. The community was left to grapple with a horrifying truth. The boogeyman wasn't a stranger. He was one of them. The story of Dennis Rader is more than just a true crime tale. It's a profound and disturbing exploration of the nature of evil. It forces us to confront the reality that the most terrifying monsters are not those who look like monsters, but those who look just like us. In the collective memory of America, the 1970s are often painted in hues of golden sunshine, a time of suburban growth and idyllic peace. Nowhere was this dream more potent than in California, the Golden State, a beacon of prosperity and laid-back living. In the sprawling suburbs of Sacramento County, families lived in quiet cul-de-sacs, their doors often unlocked, their children playing freely in the warm evenings. It was a community built on a foundation of trust. But in 1976, that foundation began to crack. A shadow fell over the Golden State, a phantom who moved through the night, turning the safest of spaces, the family home, into a stage for unimaginable terror. He was a whisper, a presence, a faceless nightmare who would elude capture for over 4 decades. He would be known by many names, but history would remember him as the Golden State Killer. Our story begins not with murder, but with a violation of a different, more intimate kind. In the tranquil, middle-class neighborhoods of Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and Rancho Cordova, a brutal series of home invasions and rapes began. The attacker, quickly dubbed the East Area Rapist by a terrified public and a baffled police force, was a predator of chilling precision. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a meticulously planned campaign of psychological warfare. He was a hunter who learned his prey's every move. He would stalk his victims, often for weeks, peering through their windows, learning their daily routines, the names of their children, the layout of their homes. His preparation was the stuff of horror films. Days before an attack, he would often enter the home while the residents were away, unlocking windows, disabling telephone lines, and sometimes even unloading any guns he found. He would move small objects, a teacup here, a photograph there, subtle manipulations designed to unsettle his future victims, making them feel a sense of unease they couldn't quite place. He was a ghost in their house long before he made his presence known. His attacks were terrifyingly consistent. He favored single women or couples, striking in the dead of night. His victims would awaken to the blinding beam of flashlight in their eyes, the silhouette of a man in a ski mask standing over their bed. His voice, a clenched teeth whisper, was the first sound they would hear, a sound that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. He would bind his victims, using shoelaces he found in their own closets, a disturbing personal touch. His control was absolute, his movements confident and unhurried. He would often spend hours in the home, a dark lord of the manor, completely at ease in the epicenter of the terror he had created. He would go through their personal belongings, not just taking valuables, but seemingly studying their lives, taking small, personal items as trophies. The physical trauma was immense, but the psychological torture was his true signature. He would call his victims weeks, months, even years after the attacks. Sometimes he would whisper threats. Other times, he would just breathe heavily into the phone, a silent, terrifying reminder that he was still out there, that he remembered them, and that he could return at any time. The effect was devastating. An entire region was held hostage by fear. Gun sales surged. Neighborhood watch groups formed. A simple knock on the door after dark could trigger a wave of panic. The safe, predictable rhythm of suburban life had been replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. The police response was massive. A special task force was assembled, pooling resources from multiple counties. Hundreds of officers worked the case, chasing down thousands of leads. But the East Area Rapist, or ER, was a ghost. He was athletic, able to vault tall fences and disappear into a network of backyards and creek beds that crisscross the suburbs. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate police movements. They developed a profile: a white male, likely in his 20s or early 30s, physically fit, and possessing knowledge of police tactics, leading many to believe he had a military or law enforcement background. But a profile is not a suspect. A ghost cannot be put in handcuffs. For 2 years, the ER terrorized Northern California, committing nearly 50 rapes, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and a police force that was no closer to catching him than they were on day one. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished from the area. The attack stopped, but the monster wasn't gone. He had simply evolved. Part 2, the evolution to murder. By 1979, the wave of terror in Northern California had subsided. The residents of Sacramento County began to tentatively reclaim their lives, hoping their nightmare was finally over. They were wrong. The predator had merely migrated south to the sun-kissed coastal communities of Santa Barbara and Orange County, and his crimes had escalated from rape to the ultimate violation, murder. On October 1st, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and Dr. Deborah Manning were asleep in their Goleta condominium when a new nightmare began. The attacker entered their home, bound them with a cord, and shot them both to death. The method, the surprise nighttime attack, the use of ligatures, was eerily similar to the East Area Rapist MO, but the outcome was fatally different. A new, deadlier chapter had begun. Southern California law enforcement, initially unaware of the scale of the ER crime spree hundreds of miles to the north, began hunting for a killer they dubbed Original Night Stalker, or ONS. For years, the two cases were investigated independently. In an era before centralized DNA databases and instant information sharing, no one made the connection. Two separate police forces were hunting two separate phantoms, never realizing they were chasing the same man. The Golden State Killer, as he would later be called to encompass all his crimes, grew bolder, his cruelty more profound. His signature tactic in Southern California was the blitz-style attack on couples. He would subdue the man, often placing a stack of dishes on his back, and issue a chilling ultimatum: "If I hear one of these plates rattle while I'm with your wife, I'll kill you both." It was a sadistic game designed to maximize psychological torture, forcing a husband to lie perfectly still, a helpless witness to the horror unfolding in the next room. After the assaults and murders, his behavior became even more bizarre and unsettling. He would linger in the home for hours. He would go to the kitchen, eat food from the refrigerator, drink beer, and then simply leave, melting back into the night. It was the ultimate act of defilement, a sign of his complete and utter contempt for his victims and for the society he terrorized. He was not just a killer. He was a parasite, feeding on the lives and the security of others. The investigation continued, but the killer remained a ghost. He left behind his DNA at multiple crime scenes, a perfect genetic fingerprint. But in the 1980s, a fingerprint without a name in a database was useless. It was a lock without a key. The profilers were certain he was intelligent, organized, and meticulous, someone who could blend seamlessly into society. He was the man next door, the friendly neighbor, the wolf who would convince the entire flock he was one of them. Then, in May of 1986, he committed what would be his final known murder. He broke into the home of 17-year-old Janelle Cruz in Irvine and killed her. After that, the trail went cold. The rape stopped. The murders stopped. The Golden State Killer vanished from the face of the earth. The years piled up, turning into decades. The case files, filled with horrific details and unanswered questions, were relegated to cold case archives. The victims' families were left in a state of suspended grief, with no justice and no answers. It seemed the perfect crime had been committed. The monster had gotten away with it. Part 3. The Ghost in the Gene Pool. For 30 years, the Golden State Killer case was a dark legend in California law enforcement, a ghost story told by veteran cops to rookies. But for some, the case was never cold. It was a burning obsession. One of those people was a Contra Costa County cold case investigator named Paul Holes. Holes had lived with the case for over 2 decades, poring over old files, re-examining evidence, driven by a relentless need to get a phantom a name. The 2010s brought a new dawn in forensic science. The key was not in a lab, but on the internet. A revolutionary new field called investigative genetic genealogy had emerged. It was a long shot, a novel approach that combined DNA analysis with public family tree websites. The strategy was to take the killer's DNA profile from a decades-old crime scene and upload it to a public genealogy database, like GeneMatch. These are sites where ordinary people upload their own DNA results from services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe to find long-lost relatives. The investigators weren't looking for the killer himself on the site. They were looking for a relative, a third cousin, a fourth cousin, anyone who shared a segment of DNA with the ghost. In 2017, working with genealogist Barbara Ray Venner, they got a hit. The killer's DNA shared a common ancestor with a handful of people in the database. This was the first thread in a massive, tangled web. Now began the truly monumental task, building a family tree in reverse. Starting with the killer's distant cousins, the team, led by Ray Venner, worked backward through time, using census records, birth certificates, and obituaries to find the common great-great-great-grandparents from the 1800s. It was a painstaking process of historical research, a genealogical hunt for a monster. Once they identified the ancestral couple, they started working forward in time, building out a massive family tree that eventually contained thousands of names. They traced every descendant, every branch of the family, looking for individuals who could be their man. They narrowed it down to family lines that had moved to California. From there, they looked for men who fit the general profile, born within a certain time frame, living in the right locations during the crime sprees. The list of potential suspects shrank from thousands to hundreds to a handful. After months of relentless, round-the-clock work, the genealogical map pointed to one small family branch, and within it, one man. He was the right age. He had the right background, and he lived in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, the very epicenter of the East Area rapist's reign of terror. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Part 4, The Unmasking. The name was a perfect, chilling fit. Joseph James DeAngelo was a Navy veteran who had served in Vietnam. Crucially, he had been a police officer in both Exeter and Auburn, California, during the 1970s, a period that directly overlapped with the East Area rapist attacks. His police career had ended in 1979 when he was fired for shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent. After his dismissal, he had worked for years as a mechanic in a distribution center, living a quiet, unassuming life with his wife and 3 daughters. He was now a 72-year-old grandfather. He was a man hiding in plain sight. But they needed more than a name and a theory. They needed his DNA for a direct match. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department launched a covert surveillance operation. Their first attempt involved secretly swabbing the door handle of DeAngelo's car while he was inside a store. The sample was too small, the result inconclusive. They needed to try again. A few days later, they followed him to a Hobby Lobby craft store. After he left, they watched him discard a used tissue into a garbage can. An investigator quickly and discreetly retrieved it. That small piece of tissue was rushed to the crime lab. The suspense was unbearable. This was the culmination of a 44-year hunt. Then the call came. The DNA profile extracted from the discarded tissue was a 1-to-1, perfect match to the DNA the killer had left at crime scenes decades earlier. The phantom had a name. The ghost had a face. On April 24th, 2018, as Joseph D'Angelo stood on his front porch, a swarm of police vehicles descended on his quiet street. He looked confused, frail, like a harmless old man wondering about the commotion. As officers closed in, he reportedly whispered, "I have a roast in the oven." The man who had shattered so many lives was worried about his dinner. The mundane and the monstrous had collided for the final time. The reign of the Golden State Killer was over. His arrest was a global news story. The man who had been a specter for so long was revealed to be nothing more than a grumpy old man down the street. To avoid the death penalty, D'Angelo eventually pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of uncharged rapes and burglaries. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. For his many surviving victims and their families, it wasn't perfect justice, but it was closure. The ghost that had haunted an entire state for nearly half a century was finally caged, his secrets exposed to the light. The case stands as a testament to the relentless dedication of investigators and the revolutionary power of science to solve the coldest of cases, proving that no matter how long it takes, no monster can hide forever. Act 1. The Drowning Land. There's a part of America that seems to exist outside of time. A land of stagnant water, Spanish moss hanging like ancient veils from cypress trees, and a humid, heavy air that muffles sound and secrets alike. This is the Bayou of Louisiana, a labyrinthine world of swamps and sugarcane fields, of tight-knit Cajun communities, and a deep-rooted poverty that clings as stubbornly as a humidity. It's a place where people can disappear easily, their absence swallowed by the murky water and the dense, indifferent landscape. For nearly a decade, starting in the late 1990s, this land held a dark secret. Young men were vanishing, one after another. Their bodies would occasionally surface in canals or remote ditches, often dismissed by authorities as accidental drownings or drug overdoses. Unfortunate but unremarkable tragedies in a region where life could be cheap. No one suspected that they were all connected, that they were all victims of a single hidden predator. This is the story of America's least known, yet most prolific serial killer of the modern era, the Bayou Strangler. To understand this case, one must first understand the invisibility of its victims. They were predominantly gay men, many of them involved in sex work, living on the fringes of society. They were drifters, runaways, a population whose disappearance often failed to trigger the kind of widespread panic or media attention that a missing suburban teenager would. They were, in the cold calculus of societal concern, often considered less dead. This societal blind spot created the perfect hunting ground for a killer who was, himself, almost invisible. He wasn't a charismatic genius like Ted Bundy, or a terrifying phantom like the Golden State Killer. He was a quiet, overweight, socially awkward man who lived in a rundown trailer. A man most people would dismiss at a single glance. His name was Ronald Dominique, and his ordinariness was his greatest weapon. Dominique was born in 1964 in Thibodaux, Louisiana. His life was a portrait of failure and social isolation. He was unemployed for most of his adult life, living on government assistance and the charity of others. He was soft-spoken, non-confrontational, and perceived by those who knew him as gentle, if a bit slow and pathetic. He lived with a female roommate in a small, cramped trailer home, a relationship that was platonic, providing him a cover of normalcy. He would spend his days watching television or aimlessly driving the back roads of the Bayou. He was, in every sense of the word, a loser. But behind this mask of pathetic inadequacy lurked a monster of terrifying proportions, driven by violent fantasies and a deep-seated rage. He was a collector of secrets, and soon he would begin collecting lives. Act 2, The Predator's Method. Starting in 1997, Ronald Dominique began his decade-long reign of terror. His method was chillingly simple and brutally effective, exploiting the vulnerability of his chosen victims. He would cruise the streets of Homa and other small Bayou towns, frequenting known gay bars and cruising spots. He would target young men who appeared desperate, for money, for a place to stay, for a moment of human connection. He would offer them a small amount of cash for sex, an invitation back to the supposed safety of his trailer. For his victims, men living on the edge, it was an offer that was difficult to refuse. Once inside the cramped, dingy trailer, the dynamic would shift violently. Dominique, a large and physically imposing man despite his passive demeanor, would overpower his victims. His weapon of choice was not a gun or a knife, but ligature, a rope, a shoelace, anything he could find. He was a strangler. The act was intimate, slow, and required absolute control, feeding his deep-seated need for power over others, a power he was denied in every other aspect of his life. The psychological component of his crimes was profoundly dark. Dominique was a necrophiliac. His primary motivation was not just to kill, but to have complete and total possession of the victim's body after death, turning a human being into an object for his own gratification. This dark secret is what elevated him from a simple murderer to a monster of a different caliber. After he was finished, he would methodically dispose of the bodies. He would wrap them in old blankets or tarps, load them into his pickup truck under the covered darkness, and drive to one of the countless remote canals, ditches, or sugarcane fields that dotted the landscape. He would dump the bodies in the water, knowing that the bayou's ecosystem, the water, the heat, the wildlife, would quickly work to decompose the evidence. For years, this method worked perfectly. When bodies were found, they were often so decomposed that determining a cause of death was difficult. The initial assumptions were almost always drowning or overdose. The victims were often unidentified, their transient lifestyles meaning no one was actively looking for them. Dominique was exploiting a tragic flaw in the system. When society doesn't value a person's life, their death is easily ignored. He was a silent killer, operating in a silent crisis. He killed with horrifying frequency, sometimes claiming multiple victims in a single month. Yet for almost 10 years, no one connected the dots. The number of missing and dead young men in the Homa region was staggering, but no single serial killer investigation was ever launched. It was a slow-motion mass murder, happening in plain sight, yet completely unseen. Act 3. The pattern emerges. By 2005, however, even the most indifferent systems could no longer ignore the numbers. Law enforcement officials in several parishes began to notice a disturbing pattern. Too many young men were turning up dead in similar circumstances. The accidental drowning theory was wearing thin. A multi-jurisdictional task force was finally created, bringing together detectives from the Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish Sheriff's offices, the Homa Police Department, and the FBI. They began the painstaking process of re-examining dozens of cold cases, looking for connections. The task force started to build a profile of their killer. They knew he likely lived locally, given his knowledge of the remote dumping grounds. They knew he targeted a specific type of victim, but they had no physical evidence linking the cases. The bodies were too decomposed for fingerprints, and DNA technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to pull a clean profile from the skeletal remains. The investigation was a massive, frustrating puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The break in the case came not from forensic evidence, but from a simple, old-fashioned piece of detective work, and the courage of a man who survived. The investigators began to believe that for a killer this prolific, there had to be someone who had gotten away, someone who had seen his face and lived to tell the tale. They put the word out on the street, urging anyone with information to come forward. Their efforts paid off. A man came forward with a terrifying story. He told investigators that he had been picked up by a large, quiet man in a pickup truck, taken back to a trailer and attacked. He described being choked and blacking out. When he came to, the attacker was assaulting him. The survivor, in a desperate act of self-preservation, pretended to be dead. The ruse worked. Believing his victim had expired, the attacker's grip loosened. The survivor seized the opportunity and fought his way out of the trailer, escaping into the night. He had survived an encounter with the Bayou Strangler. This testimony was the key that unlocked the entire case. The survivor was able to give a description of his attacker, and, crucially, he remembered details about the location. But the final definitive piece of evidence came from a different kind of mistake made by the killer. Ronald Dominique had been arrested in 2005 on a minor, unrelated charge of failing to report a change of address as a registered sex offender from a previous nonviolent offense. During that process, he had made a phone call from the police station. That call was recorded. The survivor was able to listen to the recording and positively identify the voice's attacker. It was the voice of Ronald Dominique. The net began to close. Investigators placed Dominique under surveillance. They saw the quiet, unremarkable man living his pathetic life and struggled to reconcile it with the image of the monster they were hunting. But the evidence was mounting. They had an eyewitness. They had a voice identification. They were ready to move in. Act 4, The Confession of a Ghost. On December 1st, 2006, the task force arrested Ronald Dominique at a local homeless shelter where he was seeking assistance. There was no struggle, no dramatic confrontation. The quiet, unassuming man went into custody peacefully. At the interrogation center, detectives expected a long, difficult process of denial and resistance. They were wrong. The moment the interrogation began, the dam broke. For nearly a decade, Dominique had lived a life of complete anonymity, his monstrous acts known only to him. Now, given a captive audience, he began to talk, and talk, and talk. For hours, he calmly and methodically confessed to a staggering number of murders. He spoke without emotion, without remorse, describing his crimes with a detached air of someone recounting a grocery list. He remembered every victim, every location. He became the investigation's greatest asset. He agreed to ride with detectives and point out the remote locations where he had dumped the bodies of his victims. For days, he led them through the murky backwaters of the Bayou, pointing to canals and sugarcane fields. "I put one there," he would say, his voice flat and emotionless. He solved his own crimes, giving names to the nameless, and bringing a horrifying closure to families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their lost sons and brothers. In the end, Ronald Dominique confessed to the murders of at least 23 men between 1997 and 2006, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to multiple life sentences. The case of the Bayou Strangler is a profoundly disturbing story, not just because of the killer's brutality, but because of societal indifference that allowed him to operate for so long. It's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about who we value, whose lives are deemed worthy of investigation, and whose deaths are easily dismissed. Ronald Dominique was a monster who hunted in the blind spots of society. He was a ghost, not because he was brilliant, but because his victims were invisible. His case is a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest horrors are not the ones we see on the news, but the ones that happen in silence, in the forgotten corners of the world.